And we are back, folks, for the last segment of Angular Day 2020 Virtual Edition. And we still have like two talks ready for you, so stay tuned. And first of those talks is called Testing MockStore in NgRx 9 by John Crowson. John is a software engineer passionate about building full-stack applications that scale to millions of users. He enjoys writing blog posts for the ngConf publication on the Medium and contributing to open source software, including NgRx. When he's not coding, John is an avid scuba diver. So please, everybody, welcome John.
Hello, ciao.
Hey, mate, how is it going?
It's going well. How are you guys?
Very well, very nice. Still looking for some content, so hopefully we will get some very soon. So how is this with the scuba diving? Like this year, how many dives did you manage to pull out?
I only managed to pull off a few. I think I'm 8 in this year. I was lucky enough to do a trip in early January, right before COVID.
I see.
So I've been able to do just a few, but because I love scuba diving so much and I haven't been able to do it, I did inject a little bit of scuba diving reference into my talk today.
Sounds about great. Please tell us more about your talk before we get started.
Yeah, well, so I'll just briefly introduce myself a little further. Like I was introduced, my name is John Crowson. I do contribute to NgRx unofficially in my free time because I really love NgRx. Specifically, I've done some contributions to MockStore. So that's part of what you're going to see today, both some code I contributed and also some documentation. So if you have any questions throughout the talk, I've actually pre-recorded my talk yesterday, so I'll be available in the chat. And if not, feel free to find me on Twitter. I'll have my Twitter handle in the first slide. I'm at John_Crowson, tweeting and fleeting about iOS and Angular usually. So yeah, looking forward to the talk and feel free to show some content.
Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to my talk, Testing with MockStore in NgRx 9. When I was first learning NgRx in the Angular 4 timeframe, I was tasked by my manager to write unit tests for a component that depended on the NgRx store. Now, it's not easy to write a unit test, especially when you're a beginner and when you have a bunch of NgRx elements around you to worry about. Like I mentioned in my introduction, I love to scuba dive. And when you learn to scuba dive, it's all about removing the elements around you to make things easier on yourself, allowing you to focus on what's most important. That's why we learn to dive in a swimming pool instead of the ocean. And in NgRx, a MockStore is kind of like a pool. It's going to remove all of those extra NgRx elements for you. Because testing is easiest when you have the least dependencies to worry about. And that's why I love MockStore. Let's take a look. Today, we're not going to be looking at testing elements of NgRx itself. So I'm not going to be talking about testing effects, or reducers, or selectors. Instead, we'll be looking at testing any Angular class that injects the NgRx store. For my examples, that is going to be a container component that depends on the NgRx store. First, we'll take a look at how testing was done in NgRx version 6 and prior. We'll see some of the issues with that approach. Then we'll transition to the much improved unit testing with MockStore in NgRx version 7 and mock selectors in version 8. There have been recent changes to the customer-facing API of MockStore, and I'll note that all of my examples are up to date with the latest version of NgRx. To get started, let's look at a simplified diagram of the NgRx data flow. As a refresher, when using NgRx, our components are responsible for dispatching actions. The reducers use the action and the previous state to create a new state, which we are then saving into what we call the store. Effects usually observe a subset of actions and perform side effects like making API calls. And then finally, our component listens for slices of the latest state using selectors. When we're looking at how to write unit tests for store-dependent components, we want to assert how our component behaves in response to the state it receives from its selectors. So when writing unit tests for store-dependent components, our first goal is to condition a mock state to assert component behavior against. Our second goal is to observe and validate the actions that our component dispatches. MockStore will primarily improve our experience with the first goal, but it will also have support for that second goal. In NgRx version 6, the documentation told us to do two things. We should import the store module in our testing module, and then in each test case, we should dispatch a series of actions to condition the state that we want to assert against. Before we analyze this approach, let's see an example of how we would implement this approach. As the documentation suggests, in our testing module, we will import the store module. Now, you may notice that importing the store module here in our testing module is the same way we install NgRx into our main application module. So essentially, we are fully installing NgRx into our testing module. Let's say the component we are unit testing shows items for purchases in an online store. Those items could be stored in different parts of state, but let's say this component combines all these items and shows them as a list to a user. If we want to make an assertion that the all items observable in the component return 6, in order to condition the desired state, we would need to dispatch actions. The first issue I'll point out here is that the component we're testing may not dispatch actions at all, or even if it does dispatch actions, it likely will not dispatch this specific action type you see here. For this action type has the word success in it, and for those of you that have done NgRx in the past, these types of actions, at least the naming of them, are results of API calls, which occur in a service or effect instead of a component. The second issue is, to write this type of test, we as the test implementer will have to have in-depth knowledge of how these actions and the reducers will work together to manipulate and condition the state we are trying to achieve. You may be spending lots of time looking at reducer code in this circumstance. And then in our development lifecycle, as we continue to update the implementation of these actions and the reducers, we'll have to keep coming back to this completely unrelated test just to make sure that the state is still being conditioned correctly. The final problem is that as our state becomes more and more complex, we may have to dispatch more and more actions in each test to condition the desired state. So in summary, it's a hassle to dispatch actions inside unit tests to condition a given state in your store. Returning to the diagram here we just looked at, since we're not implementing and importing the effects module, yes, it's no longer a part of the data flow, but because we're still importing the store module, we are actually using all real dependencies within NgRx. Now, this approach traditionally is considered an integration test because we're asserting how our components integrate with real dependencies. Going back to my experience learning to scuba dive, this would be like learning to scuba dive in a pool with less fish, but still keeping the sharks. It's far too much for our unit test to deal with, too many dependencies, especially for beginners. So what I wanted as an NgRx developer is a simple way to condition the state of NgRx store directly. And this is why MockStore was created in NgRx version 7. It gives us direct access to the state in the NgRx store and allows us to update the store in each test case without dispatching actions. A nice feature of this approach is that whenever a new mock state is provided to the MockStore, all the selectors in our component will automatically trigger change detection when the mock state is updated. Similar to when a reducer updates the state in a real application, causing the selectors to trigger change detection. There are two implementation steps we're going to follow. The first, we will call the provide MockStore function in our testing module. We're going to pass in an initial state as a parameter. And then secondly, whenever we want to update the state, we will call the MockStore instance's setState method and pass in the new state as a parameter. Okay, let's look at the same test we implemented with StoreModule, this time implemented with MockStore instead. The first thing we will do is import both the provide MockStore method and the MockStore object from NgRx. Then in our testing module's providers array, we will call the provide MockStore method, passing in an initial state object. This will immediately update the state in the store without executing any actions or reducers. Next, we will create that state object. Now, state objects can be large, especially in large applications. So if the component we are testing only utilizes a couple properties in the state, we can include just those properties. And then I like to cast that object. This helps prevent spelling mistakes in the keys that we do provide. Finally, we will create a MockStore instance, then instantiate it in our before each closure. This MockStore instance will allow us to update the state moving forward. Okay, in our test case, because we have an initial state set up in the before each closure with just empty arrays, we can immediately assert that the all items length should be also empty. If we wanted to also assert all items length could be non-zero for when there are actually items loaded into the state for our online shop here, we can create a new state object. This version containing 6 items in it. Then we can update the state of the MockStore using the MockStore setState method. Okay, so in comparison to the previous testing approach with StoreModule, this is already much less complex. And we're also in a more isolated state, no longer needing to know about or use actions or reducers. So here is a diagram of how that test was structured. You'll notice we're updating state directly, which is removing the reducers and possible reducer logic that goes along with it. But what if there's also logic in our selectors? Could we remove that as well to make our unit tests even further isolated? So at this point, all we're dealing with is a cute little turtle, but we can still do better. So to go one step further, how about an approach where we can directly override the values that selectors emit? With mock selectors in NgRx version 8, we can now mock and condition individual selectors without mocking the entire state. The primary benefit is that test complexity does not increase as selector complexity does increase. Here's the select all items selector that the component our examples are testing is using. This selector is relatively simple, combining 3 arrays from state. But what if the selector started combining more and more arrays in the future or added some extra logic? I would prefer to just tell the select all item selector to return a specific value instead of having to figure out how to create an increasingly complex state that will cause the selector to return that value I want it to. We already removed reducer logic with mocking store. Let's remove selector logic with mocking selectors. To set up mock selectors, we will use the provide MockStore method in the testing module. Then we will mock each selector our component depends on using the override selectors method. Let's look at the same example, test that we just saw implemented with StoreModule and MockStore, this time implemented with MockSelectors. Once again, we'll import the provide MockStore method and the MockStore object, and again use the provide MockStore method in the providers array of our testing module. This time you'll notice that we do not provide any initial mock state, and that's because in this test we will be mocking all of the selectors directly. However, selectors that do not get mocked can still fall back to a mock state. So it's possible to use a combination of mock state and mock selectors if you choose to, but in this use case for simplicity, we'll exclusively use mock selectors. Once again, we create a MockStore instance, then use the MockStore instance's override selector method, passing in a reference to the selector we want to override and the MAC value we want to return. We can also choose to save the memoized selector reference that is going to be returned by the override selector method, which will make it easy to update the mock value for that selector in future tests. Let's implement the same unit test as we have previously. Once again, we're doing an initial mocking setup in the before each section. Our mock selector will already be conditioned to return an empty array, so we can assert against that first. Then, to once again update to having 6 items to show in my component, instead of creating a new state with 6 items like we did with mocking store, I can just update my mock selectors to instead return 6 items. Now, there is one gotcha when using mock selectors that we didn't have to worry about when using MockStore. When using override selector or set result methods, the mock selector update does not automatically cause the selector to emit its new values to the component. So we must manually tell MockStore to have all selectors emit their latest value, and then tell the component to look for those new values. We can do this using a combination of the MockStore's refresh state method and the component fixtures detect changes method. So this approach is ideal for most unit tests. This is how I write a lot of mine, because it completely isolates the Angular class from its NgRx dependencies and any logic that might be in the selectors. Just a couple other notes on mock selectors. If you are writing a test that does not plan to update a certain selector, and you just want to provide a constant mock value for all tests, there's also an option in the provide MockStore method to do this. So in this example, I can mock a selector with a value, but won't have to have a reference to update it. The second note is that mock selectors are automatically reset after each test case. This is why it's important to set up a suitable initial mock value for your selectors in that before each block. The third note is that mock selectors support all selector usage types, which is awesome. I know I had a lot of trouble mocking the select RxJS operator. So whether you use the string selector or a memoized selector object, or if you're using the select method or that RxJS select operator, we got you covered. So the last thing I want to look at before I wrap up is verifying dispatched actions in MockStore. If you remember, validating that actions are dispatched appropriately is the second goal of unit testing NgRx dependent components. The way that MockStore allows the test access to dispatched actions for us to assert against is by exposing this scanned actions observable that your test can subscribe, observe, and assert against. So this will allow you to validate that certain actions are dispatched at the appropriate time. So taking a step back, all 3 of the testing methods we looked at today have a place in your code base. I use a combination of them in my tests. StoreModule is still great for writing integration tests. I like to pair it up with the effects module to do a complete integration test using both store and effects. MockStore is better for unit tests, and it has the benefit of automatically triggering state changes, as we just noted was not the case in mock selectors. There are also situations where test cases are more readable with MockStore in comparison to mock selectors, because we must verbosely list out each state completely at the top of each test case. And finally, mock selectors has the benefit of being the most isolated approach. You only have to mock what you need, and we're getting rid of all complexity of our selectors. I hope you all learned more about MockStore and its evolution through the versions today. And I want to leave you with a few closing remarks. The first is to limit the dependency on NgRx Store to only your most essential components, usually referred to as container components. Those container components can pass down data from the store to child components, and those components then won't need to know about the NgRx store, meaning less component tests that have to depend on NgRx. The second is that I recommend you seek out package-specific testing libraries whenever possible. As Angular developers, we usually know how to mock objects and inject fakes for testing purposes, usually using Jest or Jasmine, but sometimes our standard tooling doesn't fit all use cases. Has anyone tried mocking the RxJS select operator? It's really difficult. It's near impossible. So whenever you use a package like NgRx, look to see if they ship test code with it and use it. The third is that I recommend to use schematics whenever possible. Schematics are Angular command line tools that make it easier to generate files when building new features. For generating container components that will inject NgRx and depend on the NgRx store, there is a container schematic with a test depth flag, which will automatically generate boilerplate for container component unit tests with MockStore or integration tests with the StoreModule. The fourth is good news for anyone that has not yet upgraded to NgRx version 7 or higher. I know sometimes I'm guilty of waiting a little too long as well. The good news is there is a standalone package available on NPM, which I helped write, which provides the MockStore API, which is also compatible with NgRx version 5 and version 6. So everything you saw today, you should be able to use. Definitely check it out if you're still on an older version of NgRx. And finally, start small, just like we do when learning to scuba dive. The MockStore library is much simpler to pick up in new projects and for NgRx beginners. The majority of your tests should usually be unit tests instead of integration tests, so use MockStore library as your primary tool. Okay, so some references and documentation on this subject. Really, up on NgRx.io, the documentation has really increased. So I always reference people to take a look there as their primary resource. I referenced here the testing documentation and the container schematic documentation. If you'd like to take a look at these slides that I showed today, they're currently available on my website. And then finally, I'm always interested and available to help. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. Thanks.
So, John, very nice talk. Thank you. I enjoyed it a lot. And I have to say, like, that this metaphor, like with the scuba diving, really made sense, like to illustrate all those concepts. So that was very enjoyable. And I mean, it was really nice that you like went through all the history of like how these concepts evolved, because I guess like same like as me and many developers like experience like these kind of pain points when they try to like use NgRx in the previous versions and like be like responsible developers and test all their features and try to do it. And then like this setup could have been like pretty extensive. And as you demonstrated, this got like much better over time. So is there something which we can look up to like in the future? Are there some plans to make this even better, or did we like reach already like kind of like the optimal state?
Yeah, and like as you mentioned, it's totally been an evolution. So, like I said, I started at NgRx around, I believe, version 4, and it was definitely a large gap. Like I had a really hard time writing unit tests that inject were for components that injected the NgRx store. So it's been cool to see that evolve, and it's totally been a community-driven effort. Like this is something that folks throughout the community opened issues for, saying it would be great if we had a library to make this easier. And a lot of the community members are the ones that ended up implementing it and then providing documentation. So it's been really cool to see that journey. At this point, I feel like NgRx's testing library is really strong. There are some slight nuances, like having to use refresh state in certain circumstances that probably could be improved, but based on the current implementations, it makes sense. So as of today, there aren't a lot of open issues around mocking store or NgRx testing in general. But if anyone does find that there are some serious gaps, I highly recommend going to the NgRx platform repository and opening an issue, because that's exactly how a lot of these features I showed off today came into play.
Very well said. Besides that, folks, don't forget to ask questions on the hop-in if you want to ask John about something. And in the meanwhile, we will also discuss, there was already one question during the talk which you answered in the chat, but also we will say it out loud here so for everyone. So basically, Richard was asking because you showed the partial test setup, but he was asking how to handle asynchronicity of those tests. So maybe you can provide a bit more details about that.
Yeah, and I will go ahead and also provide the full test snippets for the application I showed off today. I tried to focus on just the NgRx elements, but yeah, the question was around how to handle asynchronicity in your tests. And what I usually do is either use a done block. So that's something you can do with Jasmine, is when you define your test, you basically provide a function that I usually call done. And you can basically just call it whenever your assertions are completed. So when you're waiting and you're subscribing for something in your component, that allows you to tell your test, hey, wait until these things are executed until you complete my test. But my personal favorite is to use the to be observable method. And I actually showed that on one of the last slides when showing mock actions. And that's just another way I like to use Jasmine marbles, which kind of allows you to say how you more visually say how you think your observable should emit and what values it should emit. That's another really great tool available for asynchronous testing.
Adding to that, maybe, do you also have some hands-on experience, not with Jasmine marbles, but with this RxJS test scheduler or something, which is something which basically everybody kind of has installed because they already have installed RxJS. So did you ever try to put this together?
Not as much, and that's probably because I know the person that wrote Jasmine marbles. I think I'm just biased, but let's hear your experience with it.
Well, I don't. This is why I was curious. So I just used the RxJS test scheduler for some other streams, but it would be really interesting if to use it also maybe in these kind of scenarios. But yeah, that's something to explore in the future, I guess.
There's a lot of testing libraries and ways to write the same unit test 5 ways. So I usually stick with what I'm comfortable with and what I prefer. For me, that's been Jasmine marbles, but I've seen the same test implemented several ways. So I'm glad you threw that out. There's a lot of great ways to write asynchronous unit tests.
Definitely makes sense. Besides that, basically we're speaking about possibility to both use MockStore and override selectors, and you mentioned that sometimes it can still make sense to actually go with the MockStore instead of override selectors, maybe if you have some bigger states. So maybe you can tell us about your personal heuristics which you use to decide in these kind of situations, or what's the ratio between these and that kind of test in the projects you have been working on.
Right. So usually it just depends on the component that I'm testing. So and it also depends on how complex my selectors are. So usually I'm just kind of weighing those out. I think I mentioned this, but I usually like the readability of MockStore and using overriding state. And that's because you literally have to define a new state object at the top of every single test. Sometimes with mock selectors, you can define some of them in the before each, and you provide some of them in your test, and you tend to spend some time like looking back through them to determine what selectors have already been set with what value. It can just be kind of complex after a while, depending on how much you're doing. So although I usually use mock selectors because it's the latest and greatest and it's the shallowest way to write your unit tests, occasionally I'll fall back to MockStore. So it usually depends. If my selectors are super basic, they're just returning slices of state, I'll probably go with MockStore because I'm not trying to get rid of that extra complexity. But as soon as I'm introducing a selector that's doing any kind of math, doing any kind of array combination, things that I don't want to think about how to condition a mock state to produce the value I want, that's usually when I'll say, okay, mock selectors for the win.
So this sounds like a pretty useful heuristics, because as you said, like when you have like this kind of like more complex logic in your selectors, it could be like kind of like mentally taxing to produce like some base state to get to actual real desired state which you would like to test. So I guess this is like a really great way to approach it. Besides that, from a bit different angle, we have a question like, what is your favorite place to scuba dive, or what was your favorite place in the past?
That's always a really hard question. Definitely my most recent one is in January. I was in the Red Sea off the coast of the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. And they're known as having some of the best diving in the entire world. But we did go in January, so the winter time is just a little different. So not as many big fish, but a lot of really small fish. And then probably my favorite, which might sound cliche, but it's the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. That was where I saw my first shark staring me in the face. And that's when I was like, I'm glad I learned in a pool and not in the ocean, because they have a lot of big fish. So Great Barrier Reef definitely tops the list for me.
I see. So this is where the parallel like to the story in that pond came up. Like it's like, oh god, it's happening. Like
and that's how I felt when I was writing my first test with StoreModule. I was like, there's just so much going on, and I'm scared of the store. As a new developer, you know, NgRx definitely has a learning curve.
Oh yeah.
So making things simple, especially for me, jumping into a project that was already using NgRx, it would have been really nice at the time if I had a tool like MockStore, where I can just simply set a state like I'm used to just setting a variable and not having to worry about what's going on as much behind the scenes with those big, scary elements of NgRx.
Definitely. Besides that, maybe like, I know like the talk was like about the MockStore and testing of that, but maybe you can give us like some pointers, like for people who are just starting with NgRx. Are there similar or same libraries like which provide more testing support for stuff like effects, reducers?
Yeah, for sure. So NgRx does provide a testing library for effects, but not for reducers or selectors. That's because effects are just a little bit more complicated. So you can think of effects basically as a chain that observes actions that are dispatched to the store, and then provides a bunch of RxJS operators to filter actions and then perform side effects. So the key there is, how do you provide an action to an effect that is used to listening to the actual NgRx store? So NgRx does provide a testing library for effects, and they provide you a function called provide mock actions, which does exactly that. You can provide actions for your test effects to listen to instead of listening to the real store. So that's really handy, and that's been around actually longer than MockStore has. So that was probably something that very early on developers realized was a gap that they needed filled. For selectors and reducers, there probably isn't one required. Selectors and reducers are pure functions. They're just functions like you would write anywhere else in your application. And you basically just tell NgRx, hey, here are my functions, use them. So what's nice about that is you're not dependent on any part of NgRx in the functions. They're completely pure. And because of that, you can just write unit tests for your reducers and selectors like you would any other function, provide some input into their parameter, call the function, and then just assert the output.
Exactly. I think like that's like actually like kind of like this unit testing like best case scenario where you literally like are so isolated that like it's really pure, provide one value, get another value. And that's actually like a very cool thing about the architecture of NgRx in general, that they made these choices like early on, that you don't have to build any kind of context to test those two major parts of the whole library, which is really, really amazing. Okay, so if I see like there is no more questions in the chat and we still have quite some time, so I guess we will have some pause after that. So anyway, John, thank you very much for the amazing talk. Like if you still feel free like to hang out like in the chat or in the hallway track if you feel like, right? And thanks again, and wish you a great rest of the day and the conference.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun. And since I'm on the United States time zone, I'm finally getting on to watch some of these talks. So I'm really excited to see the next one after me. So thank you so much for having me, and find me on Twitter or in the chat to answer some more questions. Ciao.
Ciao, John.